Good evening, and the very warmest of welcomes to King's this evening. My name is Sam Young. I'm one of the assistant heads in charge of academic enrichment, and I am delighted to welcome you all this evening to the first of this academic year's Enlightening Minds lecture series. Now in its second year, the Enlightening Minds lecture series is designed to nurture and ignite intellectual curiosity across the entire King's community. This evening, a huge thank you both to everyone who's joined us in person in the concert hall and also to those who are tuning in remotely from home via the live stream, wherever home might be around the world. For those of you in here in person, in the unlikely event of a fire this evening, our pupil hosts, Alfie and Hannah, and I will direct you to leave the concert hall and make your way onto the first 15 rugby pitch, but I think that is hopefully an unlikely event. We are delighted to be able to put on these intellectually inspiring talks free of charge to members of the King's community. Thank you to those of you who have, as they booked their ticket, kindly made a donation to the school's bursary fund. If you haven't already done so, then do please consider donating retrospectively via the King's community page on the school website. Finally, before I hand over to our pupil hosts, I would like to flag the Q&A at the end of this evening's talk. For those who are joining us via the live stream, do please feel free to engage by asking a question via X, formerly known as Twitter, using the handle #KCS Enlightening Minds. Once again, thank you so much for being here tonight and supporting the Enlightening Minds lecture series. I'll now pass over to Hannah Bora and Alfie Edmondson to introduce this evening's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we welcome Emma Ridgway, Director of the Foundling Museum in London, to give her talk on foundlings, care, and the arts. This evening's talk is in connection with our senior school production of Coram Boy, and we hope to communicate some of the meaningful material in our play.
The Foundling Museum tells the tale of the Foundling Hospital, which was established in 1739 by Thomas Coram. Emma Ridgway will share poignant stories of love, loss, and care expressed through the arts and heartfelt objects found at London's Foundling Museum. Please join your hands together in welcoming Emma Ridgway.
Good evening. Thanks so much to Anna and Alfie for that lovely introduction. Thank you. So, I will speak about the Foundling Museum. So the Foundling Museum is a contemporary museum. It looks like that. It was established actually in 2004, which is quite recent relatively, and it's got collections of art and music and writing and emotive objects that stretch back to the 18th century. And the Foundling Museum is the only cultural institution in the UK to celebrate people who have experience of being in care and the people who care for them. And it's useful to understand that a foundling, which is always the first question that comes to many people's minds with the name Foundling Hospital, a foundling is something very specific. It's a really affectionate term, but it doesn't refer to a baby left to die in abandonment, nor does it refer to an orphan. It's quite a romantic term in some ways that refers to a child being left in order to be found and cared for by the kindness of strangers. That's the implication of that old-fashioned term. And the idea being that somebody else could care for the child better than its birth parents, not a situation people want to be in. And the idea as well, we'd refer to it as a child in care, and particularly foster care, because the suggestion, particularly with the Foundling Hospital when it was set up, was that people could return to pick up their children if their circumstances improved. So this is an image by Hogarth, who was probably one of the best known artists in the early 1700s, and he was very involved with the early Foundling Hospital as well. So this is an image called Gin Lane, and it's characteristic of Hogarth's artwork. He's known for doing works that really show abuses of power and situations that were happening in London in the 1700s that people were choosing to turn away from. But there was huge shifts going on in the 1700s, and the Foundling Hospital was established as the UK's first ever children's charity in 1739. The Foundling Hospital didn't mean a medical hospital. It meant a place of care. So it was a children's home. And it was the brilliant idea of Thomas Coram, who is an unusual, very enterprising person. You can't hear?
Could you make it a little louder? It's very difficult to hear.
Okay. Is it possible to make it a bit louder, Daniel?
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Is that clearer?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I was just I'll speak about Thomas Coram a little. So I'll say a few things about the 1700s in London, but in the UK more broadly. It was a really extraordinary time. So you had huge amounts of shipping and international movement of people and goods and ideas. And it was a time, when you look at it, where the idea of the Enlightenment particularly springs from. People are often thinking of this period. It was multi-layered. It was very international with its belief systems. And there was lots of questions being asked about life and about human nature and societies and rights and equalities. And there was big intellectual questions about what shapes us and what makes us who we are. So is it that the religious ideas, that our path is decided already for us in a fatalist way? That was more coming under question. It had really held strong for a long time. Or is it our experiences, our lived experiences, that shape who we are and how we operate in life? And what freedoms are there for humans? There's questions about what our emotions play as a role in who we are as well. And there was also questions, even in the early 1700s, about if women are equal to men, or if women and children are property of men. And there was many different international and different ways of thinking about these different ideas. And it's easy to forget what a time of change and transition it was. Also in London, there was new strange forms of child mortality rates. They were very, very, very high in this period. So you had lots of people moving into a city that was having a population explosion. Lots of different heritages of people coming together, and people from all over the UK coming to try and make a bit of money in London. And one of the difficulties that Thomas Coram saw after he'd been for over a decade in the States, because as shipmaker he had gone to the Americas, was when he returned to London, he saw that children were being left on the streets in really destitute situations, even babies. And whilst the death rate for children under 5 was very, very high, it was about 75% mortality rate, which is incredibly high, that there wasn't any way to address this and that people were turning away from it was something that he found genuinely shocking. He campaigned for 17 years to try to encourage people to set up an institution of the sort they had in some other countries in Europe to care for children for a while. And the church didn't want to be involved, so it had to be a secular organisation. At that point, it wasn't in the purview of government to be involved with such things either. And he was only successful with his campaign when he had the involvement of women, particularly influential women, and artists, and particularly famous artists. Because what they recognised, and what an artist such as Hogarth recognised, was that with the arts, you can draw people into emotionally turning towards different ideas and experiences than they would want to with the hard evidence in front of them, or just by being told the facts of the situation. And so Hogarth in particular had this really strong idea of how powerful the arts could be in shaping how we understand things, and how by putting your imagination into conveying things through images and through music, that actually shifted and changed how people understood real life, and then that could change their behaviours. As part of the Foundling Hospital, Hogarth made this portrait, which looks particularly striking. That's the size that's projected here is about the size it is in real life. So it's a full-scale portrait in oil. That is Thomas Coram, and that is all his own hair, which I think is really impressive, because they usually, all the big wigs were really in at that time. And he didn't wear one of those wigs because he chose not to, which he could have done that. But he wasn't from the class that was expected to do that, and he didn't want to. He was also known for not being too careful about his clothes, quite practical. It's a little hard to tell on this image. What he has in his right hand there is he's holding the Royal Charter. So after 17 years, very much with the help of a group of women who came together and called themselves the 21 Ladies of Quality and Distinction. And they were able to compel and encourage their husbands, who were earls and lords and had a lot of sway, to then petition and persuade the king to grant a royal charter for the first ever children's charity in the UK. This painting was done, and what you can't see here is near the bottom, written very clearly at eye level. It says this was painted by William Hogarth, who was already famous at the time, and was gifted to the Foundling Hospital. So he wanted to encourage artists to gift work to this cause, because this was something that had always been a situation of private shame and very stigmatized if somebody couldn't care for their child. And his idea was, if we make this very public and make it something that lifts one's thinking about how we look after each other and what we do with the powers we do have, that can really change this social challenge and situation, particularly of children being abandoned because it was too difficult to care for them. Or the laws, for some of the lower classes, if your child was sickly, if your child died in your care, you could be sent to prison for manslaughter, irregardless of the fact the child mortality rate was high across all the different classes and loads of different circumstances. So there was a real huge risk to people. This portrait in itself is super unusual, not only for being a gift, but also for, he's got all his own hair, because the painting is a statement, because it's the first ever full-size portrait of a citizen made in Britain. All previous portraits of this style were of the upper classes and aristocrats. So Hogarth was being really deliberate with that. He had strong ideas, they both had strong ideas about what citizenship could be and how it could be much more equal. And they were big believers in the many ideas that were around at the time, that there's great potential in people. And actually, if people aren't so exploited and they are given opportunities, they can be useful members of society in all sorts of different ways. So this was the coat of arms that Hogarth designed for the Foundling Hospital, which I completely adore. The original sketch is quite small, but as you can see, it speaks to this multiple belief systems that's around at the time. Usefully, he did write little labels over the top, because when he was presenting it to the governors and people he had to persuade, the multi-breasted goddess on the right might not have been familiar to everyone as to why she was there, and the symbolic goddess on the left was Britannia. This speaks to how early this all is. The representation of the multi-breasted abundance of nature And there was a strong belief at the time that it was a sacred and extraordinary thing that women could have children, and also that Mother Nature, and this is across multiple different religions and called many different things, that it is the female sacred that is the creative force that makes life, that creates everything on the earth, and also that artists tap into when they're making creative work. On the left is Britannia, and at the time, Scotland there was still very much clashes with the idea of Scottish independence, and there was continued clashes in terms of if Britain was England taking other countries or if it was one united space. So having Britannia there was at the time a newer idea than we might think of it now. In the centre is a little baby, and the baby is on its own. I think of it as the charismatic baby because it's making an appeal to us. Also, it's a newer idea that was burgeoning at the time through this period was the idea that we're all born as individuals with great potential, and you don't quite know what somebody's going to grow into. So that idea that each person can grow and be shaped by their environment was something in the more progressive ideas that are super familiar to us now. At the bottom there, it says help. It was written in English. It was rare for a coat of arms to be written in English, but it was so citizens could read it. And when there were pupils at the Foundling Hospital, which was a children's home, and also schooled them, they could read it too. The idea being everybody can bring something to help this challenging cause. That's it worked up into an engraving by a different engraver than Hogarth. And it was used very, very widely in the 1700s. And there's the Foundling Hospital continued over 200 odd years. They started just using the lamb, which was much more palatable to the sort of early Victorian taste as to what one has in terms of representing a brand or a logo. A simple lamb seemed much more Christian and Protestant and probably sensible than the whole Baroque presentation before. So the Foundling Hospital in the museum, it's a really unusual combination of things. Because of this compelling, really, particularly of Hogarth, but many others, there's works that we have from the 18th century that are really incredible, and we continue to work with artists today who are leading in their field, and we invite them in to respond to children and young people and the experience of being in care. So in the centre there is a little hard to see, but it's an image of a sculpture by Yinka Shonobare, and it's called Trumpet Boy. And why he made, and it has, as a head, it has this wonderful cosmos globe, because during the Enlightenment period, that idea of being part of the universe and these bigger ideas were really compelling and important part of the time. It's playing a trumpet because at the Foundling Hospital, throughout its history, the accounts from the Foundlings, there's something interesting that connects them together. Often they'll talk about the lack of love within the experiences they had in a way that's quite painful to hear about. They will talk about how incredibly disciplined their time was at the Foundling Hospital. And this can be, people were still in the residential Foundling Hospital until 1954. So it ran for a hugely long time. But from early accounts to the final pupils who were there, it's the music that they say was the joyous aspect and the really brightening, wonderful moments of life at the Foundling Hospital. So Trumpet Boy is an uplifting, beautiful symbol and very meaningful to the people who know the Foundling Hospital well. Behind, you can see a bit of a site-specific poem, and that's by the poet Lem Sissay. And Lem Sissay is an extraordinary writer and poet, and he himself was in care in the UK And he has done extraordinary amount of sharing his experiences so that people have a better understanding of the lived experience of care. So with this project, it's called Superman Was a Foundling. And throughout literature, foundlings, and sometimes orphans and others, are used as the start point or key points for stories that become very well known. So Jane Eyre is listed. People stand and read this wall for quite some time. Han Solo, Spider-Man was abandoned, Superman was a foundling, because if you think it through in those terms, he was actually sent to planet Earth in his little weird pod thing, to be found, to be brought up as a human. Then he had these unusual powers, and so had to have his foster mum made him those unusual lycras. And then it ended up being found out that actually he'd been sent from another planet to call for help and other things. So these stories of Harry Potter is another. So there's something fascinating when the birth origins of a person isn't known. And it really sparks the imagination. And in literature, there's a rise of it again at the moment, actually. I think Doctor Who is referencing foundlings a lot, that Doctor Who was a foundling. And I think his sister too, that's in the latest series this year. Hetty Feather is another character people might know from literature. Hetty Feather is a character. It's one of the nicest ways to research about the history of the Foundling Hospital is just to watch an episode of Hetty Feather on the BBC. It is so much more enjoyable than reading the really difficult accounts of child mortality in Georgian times. But it's beautiful storylines and really, really wonderful. It's set in the Victorian period of the Foundling Hospital. And Jacqueline Wilson is the writer. And that was part of a commission by the Foundling Museum, inviting Jacqueline Wilson, who is known and loved for writing on young people who are being cared for and in difficult moments in their life. And it was her first historical work, and it became a huge international hit. Rapunzel was fostered, he nominates, and throughout history, there's big surges of people becoming fascinated with the founding stories. Dickens is one of the people who became very interested and was close with the Foundling Hospital at the time that he was around, which was much later than this most early period, which I find most fascinating in the 1700s, because it drove innovations in art and in art being something in public life. This room looks like a Rococo room that you might find in a National Trust property, but it's actually slightly different from that. This room was designed by Hogarth and others, and it is the first ever art gallery in Britain. And it is fully intact as they made it. It is an incredible art installation, I would say, as a modern and contemporary art person, in that it's designed for you to walk into it and different views show you different aspects of understanding yourself in relation to foundlings. So it's a secular organisation, but the artists themselves chose to represent some stories from the Old Testament because they knew they'd be understood by Christians and people of Jewish faith and people of Islamic and Arabic cultures. And one of the stories that they show on two paintings is a story of Moses, because Moses was a foundling. And it also depicts, by showing this, and they also have a representation of Hagar and Ishmael on the other wall. Hagar was a handmaiden who was forced to have a child through of her master at the time, and it speaks all these different circumstances, speak to the things that were still in the 1700s and still right up until the 1970s, the reason there was such cause for foundling care, which was concerns around illegitimacy and women being in circumstances far beyond their control. So the stories are known of these women because they're Bible stories. It is Moses' mum needing to rescue him from the persecution of the wars that are going on between Egypt and the lands we'd call Israel and Palestine now, and that she had to save him temporarily. And these stories that roll on and contemporaneously feel less alien than they could or should. So they were trying to put a longer history through the tale of foundlings and how it comes about. It's also this beautiful, ornate representation of nature, which goes back to the Mother Nature representations that we are all part of nature and the natural world. They also have a bust of Marcus Aurelius in there. Early on in the Foundling Hospital history as well. This painting on the left, that's about the size of that in real life as well. It's one of the largest paintings of foundlings, and it is recently exhibited. We put it up in September. It's by Teresa Schwartz, who was a very well-known painter in the late 1800s. And it's foundling girls singing in the chapel. This on the right is the Alleluia chorus, which is by the composer Handel. And he first performed the Messiah as a fundraiser for the Foundling Hospital to contribute to raising funds to build a chapel. And it was the perfect fit because it was not religious enough to be performed in a religious institution, but it was too secular for a music concert hall. So the Foundling Hospital walked just the right line for him in terms of presenting that as a public performance. And in the first performance, King George II came, Prince and Princess of Wales came. They had to immediately say they would do another performance because they had so many people, they couldn't fit them all in. He also wrote the Foundling Hospital Anthem, which is an amazing mashup as a piece of music, if you listen to him, because he often will reuse sections of his music. They performed it at Barbican, I think the beginning of last year. It's kind of amazing. And the idea that children would sing this really elaborate piece of music is incredible. The choir in the chapel, when it was eventually built, the Messiah was presented as the fundraiser for 7 years and was the largest income generator for the Foundling Hospital because there was they had to always raise money as they went along the whole time. And when Handel made his will, he bequeathed the rights to the orchestral pieces to the Foundling Hospital so they could continue using it as a fundraiser. So that association of artists using their fame to put a spotlight on a social cause that had been so stigmatized that people would often turn away from it. But they were confident that their art forms could, with music, bring people together to be kind of synchronized in the emotions of how when we listen to music and draw people from many different backgrounds all together. It was the kind of very cool thing to do to come and watch the Foundling children sing. And artists of all different art forms would go to the chapel to watch the Foundling choirs, pre-television, obviously. Very early in the Foundling Hospital history, there was a dilemma of how you would fairly accept babies. There was a problem across London as to child mortality. Women were in situations where they couldn't care for their children themselves. So how do you do it fairly? They came up with an incredibly unusually fair method in the first section of time, which was done solely through probability. They would, in papers and shops, they would put an announcement that they were going to have an intake of babies. They would do it under the cover of night, so nobody would see who was coming with their child. It would be completely anonymous, so it didn't matter what your background was, how you arrived, or what time you arrived. Then everyone would go into this large room, which is called the picture gallery, and the woman would have her baby. The baby needed to be, I think think, under 2 months, and then the age went up a bit to under 6 months. In the centre there, that woman has putting her hand into a sack to pull out a ball, like a billiard ball type thing. If it was a white ball that she drew, then her baby could get accepted into the hospital unless it had a transferable infection, because all the babies were going to be wet nursed and then passed to a foster mum who would also wet nurse. So they didn't want any infections going into healthy families or infecting other babies. So that was the rule, essentially. If you drew out a red ball, then you were on the waiting list for that evening. They only took in about 30 babies per intake, and then they would announce a number of months later when they were ready to take in another group of children. It was so they could afford the care to be of a good quality. If you took a red ball, you were then waiting that evening, quietly hoping somebody's child wouldn't pass the health test. And the amount of crying, apparently, at these events was just colossal, because there was also a black ball, and if you drew that, then you just had to leave. You were blackballed, and that meant you had to exit. So you have to take your baby and work out what to do, so that's incredibly distressing. Or you're waiting all evening to see if maybe your baby could be taken in to be cared for, which is incredibly stressful also. And these are people who are in a very vulnerable, challenging state, who made a really, really difficult life decision. Or your child is going to get taken into the Foundling Hospital care, and you may never see them again. So the incredible kind of compassion and distress, but being able to hold that as an emotional space, I think, is amazing. And they kept doing that. And the emotionality through arts and the emotionality of such events and how genuinely challenging this is something that people often dial down, I think, in terms of how they're thinking about these experiences, because they seem like private, intimate experiences. But the difficulty and the problem with seeing this as a private event, and why they wanted to make a public institution, was this is a shared concern for everybody. There is not stigma to the mother, there should not be stigma to the child. And still now, people who we work with, who have experienced care, still struggle and are frustrated by the level of stigma there is around this issue. Increasingly, there's really fascinating stories and understandings about women's biology and physiology, and that birth has always been a very social activity, and also that it's exceedingly social to bring up a child. So one of the challenges has always been, and will always be, there will be circumstances that mean a birth parent can't look after their child at some point. But because all children need scaffolding, it's just that at times that scaffolding that the birth parents or parent usually supplies isn't possible, either at all or for some time. And how you then support children to navigate through life and support the mothers to go on and shape their life more was a big hope right at the beginning of the Foundling Hospital and all the way through. If your child was taken that evening, you went and spoke to an administrator. Oh, this is just that room now. So it looks like that. I love this picture. This is it being used as the girls' dining room as well. And these tokens are identifying tokens that, particularly in the first couple of decades, that parents would leave as a way of identifying their child. They were initially intended as just administrative items because most people couldn't read or write, and it was a very material culture, so everything was understood about being there in person, about how things felt. Everything was done through meaningful objects, were very loaded with emotionality in this particular setting, even though the original intention was a token that would mean. that if you were in better circumstances, you could come and collect your child, which is very different from the idea of abandonment. Only you would know what token you'd left, and they would write a description of the token. They'd put the physical token in a piece of paper, it's called a billet, and they'd write just some details. So you might say, my daughter was called Clara, she had a birthmark on her knee, and she had tight black curls. And I named her Clara Jane. They wouldn't take the name of the person leaving the baby, so there was full anonymity, so no stigma could be traced, and all they had was knowing what that token was, or the other half of that token. It was an amazing approach, and the token collection we have are incredible because every single one sparks our imagination and came from a place of imagination. So whoever brought the child was hoping that their child would do better than if it was under their own care, which is a huge leap of faith that you're doing for anybody, to place that hope in other people. It also means you're imagining a future moment, a hopeful moment, where you may be able to come back and collect the child, but you're also probably flooded out with anxieties and concerns as well, because you're already in a circumstance that means you might not be able to look after yourself, or you certainly know you can't look after a child. So these are absolutely fantastic. There's a huge range of tokens. I've included only 2 here partly because they're quite unusual ones. This artwork there's an artist called Emma Brownlow, and she was making art in the Victorian times, and she actually grew up in the Foundling Hospital, not because she was a foundling, but because her dad was the CEO, the secretary. Interestingly, he had been a foundling. And because he'd been a foundling, but was a really gifted kid, the hospital was smart in terms of when they had very, very bright young people, because people would be taught to read and write and do arithmetic regardless of class, race, gender, and the particularly bright kids would be employed by the staff at the Foundling Museum, Foundling Hospital, essentially. And Emma Brownlow, so John Brownlow is represented in the background there. He introduced things, far more playfulness, trips, music, training, all the things that he knew when he was growing up there, he would have really liked, and so would his friends. So it was a particularly exuberant, positive time in the Foundling Hospital history, and Dickens became good friends with him too and was very inspired by this unusual person. And he was writing fantastic accounts of the artists in the early period and what a difference that made. This painting is by his daughter. She wanted to capture some scenes of the Foundling Hospital. It's deemed to be quite a romantic picture, but it's still the nearest we've got to a bit of evidence. It's called A Mother Reclaiming Her Foundling. They call the foundling It's, which really bugs me every time, and I really want to change the name of the painting, because that objectifying is so peculiar, and it's so peculiar and a further slight dehumanizing that's happened already to those children. Their names changed when they came into the Foundling Hospital. They're then referred to a foundling and its mother. That's the title, Its Mother. And I think that object descriptor, when it's so clearly a little girl, there's something in that speaks to the time and speaks to the complexity of the identities and the shutting down of individualism that could happen with institutional care. But it is a mother with her certificate of contract that proves that she can pick up this small child. The 2 other tokens here are unusual. Most people were not able to reclaim their children. There is more accounts that are very sad accounts of people making the money, getting themselves in better circumstances, coming back to the Foundling Hospital, only to find that their baby actually died. The rates of child mortality was about 66% in that period, so a bit lower than otherwise, but it was still exceedingly difficult to take children to full adolescence and adulthood because of the amount of infections and diseases and It can be from chicken pox to all sorts of things that we now have far more immunisation and protection from. On the top there is a small coin that's been polished. On the other side of it, it's got beautiful a crescent and some stars. And the mother has inscribed it John Cuthbert with his date of birth as well. That child would never have known their name was John Cuthbert because it would have been changed when they came into the Foundling Hospital. And none of the children knew that there was these administrative, essentially, items that were so often really imbued with love as an object in themselves. His mother unusually was able to claim him, and she was a spinster, which is even more unusual because she was going to bring him up solo. When you came back to claim your child, you also had to repay the cost of looking after the child that had already been invested by the Foundling Hospital, bearing in mind that the foster mums were all outside of London, and they were healthy families and they were paid well to ensure that the babies aged 0 to 5 would go to foster care outside of London and then be brought back to the institutional care aged about 4 or 5. But all of that had to get paid for, and they had an amazing spike in terms of increase of numbers of people claiming their children when they stopped charging people for the paid for care already. So loads more people wanted to pick up their little ones than could. And the lock at the bottom there, ER, was referencing Elizabeth Reeves, which was the birth name given to that baby. And that birth mother came and picked up that child when she was about, I think it was about 8. And interestingly, what she bought, or she had to bring, was the key to that padlock. So she didn't have to remember what it was she left or cut something in half. So there's quite a few padlocks in the collection. But picking up a child was unusual and actually could be quite difficult depending on what age the child was. They'd already had a number of disruptions, these children are young people, and this was yet another one. So very, very complicated circumstance, and sometimes it didn't work out when people were reunited. And that's still the case now, sometimes when there's reunifications with people finding their birth parents. Sometimes it works, sometimes it takes a couple of different encounters, very spaced apart, because how we are as emotional mammals and social beings is exceedingly complicated. And the most complicated aspects are around our relationships and how we imagine things could be or might be, and that's a huge part of love and relationships. And it often doesn't match up to the reality in so many ways, and that's the beauty and brilliance of it. But when there's a huge separation, I think those imaginings can be so different from each other. It makes coming back together really, really challenging. This is, sorry, it's a little hard to tell. We've got 3 historic rooms and a historic staircase, all from the 1740s. I included this one. The star artwork is actually on the right over there. It's Hogarth's March of the Guards Finchley. He regards it as his finest painting. But the reason I was showing this one here is the sculpture of the boy by an unknown sculptor. It's really wonderful. What I was very taken with was the children lived with this art in the institution they were growing up in, and that was their favourite. This very kind of Peter Pan-like free kid who is just so confident. He's clearly not got parents, probably either. He's just incredibly solid and confident and enjoying just being himself. So unsurprisingly, the uniformed, disciplined foundlings really found some freedoms in enjoying that sculpture. We work a lot with people with early years, and we work with contemporary artists a lot, and we do most of what we do is through the arts, because the arts has a way of engaging us and inviting us into a quality of time together, which is about paying attention to things that we might not otherwise pay attention to. It's an opportunity to spend time for kind of imaginations to open up. it's very materially based, or you're listening together and you're doing things together, and it really can get to parts of us that day-to-day life doesn't always. The program that we have with young adults who've been in care but have left care is a professional arts training program, visual arts and also creative writing. The trainees are paid to train with us, and they're professionally trained as artist assistants, and then they also work doing the workshops that we do with lots of the nursery schools and libraries around, and we have a lot of workshops as well at the museum. And very particularly, the program is devised so that it shapes people's professional skills, so often really supports people getting into different forms of work. And people say as well that when they have been in care, knowing there's a whole huge, extraordinary, interesting history to care and how people have engaged with it through the arts, that actually gives them forms of ownership of heritages and a sense of genealogy that often there's been such disruption when they've been placed in care of an idea of what their family is or what their heritage is or how you associate over long periods of time, that many of us who haven't been in care just take for granted, that we have that sense of connection to different things. That's my lovely colleagues holding the Museum and Heritage National Award for Learning Programme of the Year. Here's some of our creative workshops. The museum sometimes can be very quiet, and then other times it's just full of children and young people, and music often is something that comes through the space in the most amazing way as we have concerts and things. And as this young person says, hands down, working with the Foundling is the best thing that's ever happened to me. If it wasn't for the museum's traineeships, as the arts traineeships, I wouldn't be the person I am today, because these opportunities are genuinely life-changing. We also continue to work with a number of the young people, and so they're advising on our exhibition program. There was a project that we're going to do a next iteration of, which is with the National Gallery, co-curating with them, so that people learn a big range of professional skills and things. This is Lem Sissay, speaking about the importance of there being the Foundling Museum. The Princess of Wales is extremely supportive. She's our royal patron and joined us a few years ago, and she has been absolutely great. She knows quite a lot of our young people now who we work with, and she is very supportive because her focus is early years, and early years, getting those right and stable for people and interesting as experiences that are creative and encouraging makes a huge difference to all of us. So this building is actually from the 30s. I think I'm slightly running over time. So this was the old building from 1740. The best bits of it were literally cut out and walked over the road, and the 1930s building to look like a 1740s building, but like we've got something like, I can't remember the dimensions, but say it's something like 10% of the size, but we've got the grandest rooms. They literally cut them out and walked them over and reinstalled them. It's brilliant. It's relocated rooms, not... So this is how huge it was. So this is near King's Cross. And this is, we would be going up what's now a very, very cool little street called Lamb Conduit Street. That's where that carriage is coming from. Interestingly, those walls all around it, they're still there. This is me just doing a bit of a mashup of Google Maps with an architecture plan on top. A bit hasty, but it gives you a sense of how huge this place was. And the architecture was beautiful, I mean, really beautiful. The stairwell we have in the museum is the Foundling stairwell. And what I was struck by is the sort of stairwell you see in a really elegant Georgian manor house. But it was for the children. And I love that nod of respect to having the architecture and the art around the children. In itself, there's something respectful about that. They're not coming in the back way or having some sort of second-rate stairwell. So this whole huge main bit of the... Oh, there's a thing here. It's not gonna, that whole building got taken down. the walls that you can see there, they're not stables, which is what you think when you first look at it. Much more enjoyably, their original curriculum was worked out by a medic and some others, very carefully worked out, how do you bring up all these children together? It was, nobody had done it before. How do you have them healthy, educated? How do we do it? How do we do it? When the architect heard that part of their structured program each day was wake up at 7 o'clock, 1 hour of play. Then you do your classes and then 1 hour of play, and then you have your dinner in silence, and then you do your afternoon chores and whatever you're doing, and then it's 1 hour of play, and then you have dinner. 3 hours of play a day. I think that's what we all need. I think that's fantastic. And so the architect, on hearing this, built these fantastic big shelters, so that because the weather is too poor in London to have children playing out all year round. So in anticipation of the 3 hours of play a day, I loved that he built those. So the blue bits are still there, and that now is a charity called Coram Field. They have the whole site as a park, and you're only allowed in this area as an adult if you're accompanied by a child. The whole area, because of the heritage of the Foundling Hospital, is a children's rights area. So Great Ormond Street Hospital, Coram Adoption Agency is there. Coram Fields is all set up and run as a local scheme for local residents. And then we have those 3 rooms and the stairwell. And we're just where that little heart is, just at the top there. And then the whole rest of the building was taken down. So it's an unusual setup. And there's a little video we could watch there, but it's just sort of 2 minutes. I'm looking at Daniel. Maybe. Let's see if it plays. No, it doesn't. Do I play from there? Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is Lem Sisse, who's got a huge following as a poet, and he's really wonderful. And he just does this short welcome and introduction to the Foundling Museum.
I'm Lem Sisse. Come and find out why this is my favourite museum. Here you will find art and objects that connect the past, the present, and a deeply moving story of care. It's poignant, it's moving, and it's profound. Once you've discovered the Foundling Museum, you will never forget the Foundling Museum.
So, I've shared more with you than you were expecting, and there's probably some things you imagined I might say that I haven't said. But I think it's over to Anna and Alfie to share the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Emma, for such a thought-provoking talk on foundlings and the arts. So can we give Emma a round of applause, please? Yes, so I think it's now time for our Q&A session for this evening. We do invite members of the floor to ask any questions that you may have, but we do also remind those watching online that you can chime in with a question using the hashtag KCS Enlightening Minds. So yes, any questions from the floor?
Yes. You mentioned the spike in parents coming back for their children once they didn't have to pay anymore, and I was wondering when that happened. So what was the time period where parents were still expected to pay back some of that care that their child was given?
If I could have remembered the date, I would have told you. I think I could, a bad guess, but worth checking our website. I think it was the first 20, 30 years. So it was quite a long period where people had to pay back, and they would have to pay back, I mean, everything. The kind of the cab that brought the baby back from the foster mum to London to leave it at such and such's house, so the mum goes pick it up from there. I mean, so it really was challenging to make enough money and get yourself back on your feet enough to be able to repay. After that period, which was for most of the Foundling Hospital history, people would, how the admissions happened changed a lot over time, but also the idea of how you collected your child changed. The tokens were only used for the first bit of time, but people kept using them because they loved the idea of them. But coming to reclaim your child ended up being you would have to essentially petition and persuade a committee of governors. So you're sitting as a often young mum, making the case in front of people of a different class to you, of men who are in a position of authority. And one of the brilliant former pupils was mentioning, so he's now in his 80s, he didn't know that his mum tried to come and pick him up. And she had to advocate for herself in that Rococo courtroom, two people very different from her, and they decided she wouldn't be able to look after them as well as they could. So it's like every institution and every single everything, it's the individuals who are there, how wise they are, how kind they are, and how things work as to what makes things fairer. You know, in some sense, if you can pay it, you can take your child. That's different from you have to prove to us that you can be a safer, better environment than we feel we can give your child as an institution. That's a pretty hard thing to prove to people who might not regard you without the stigma that was the original intention of the place.
Thank you so much for your incredible talk. I hadn't realised just how much of the play actually is based in the true stories of what had happened, right down to the red, yellow, and red, white, and black ball. I had a couple of questions, but one was really fascinating to hear that the power of art was used to change people's minds about this. And I was just going to ask you if you think art still has that power today.
The reason I went to the Foundling Museum was because it's the only place. I went there for that. It's not an aspect of it that's been particularly amplified before, but I've trained as an artist at Goldsmiths in the late 90s. I've worked in contemporary art, modern art, and I know the difference it makes to people. I also know how uncomfortable people have got at claiming the confidence that art and music and different art forms have to affect people emotionally, such that it affects their behaviours and makes them see things differently. And this was one very particular moment in British art history, I'd say, and it was also secular, but recognising that there's reasons that religion has always used art forms. And it is because they are that compelling and they're that persuasive. They're an enormous part of how we communicate to each other about relationships and imaginings and how we move through and emotionally transition through things. So that's why I went there, was to draw more of that out. So I do think it's really that powerful. I think we haven't quite got the language for it, and how we think about change and evidencing change now has got so orientated around the quantitative, as in can you count it, that some of the biggest things get devalued in peculiar ways. Simple things. Why would you have a whole gender who's a second-class citizen, even though they're the gender who gives birth to all the citizens? I mean, there's some things that are so big for us to understand in terms of what drives us and who we are as an amazing social species that tries to help each other a lot at our best when there's not too many pressures on. And I think the arts is somewhat in that bracket of things we're not very good at proving, but we feel it and we kind of know it, and it's in that same strange bracket as love, in that it's so big in terms of its effect on us. We don't quite have the language for it in the ways that we do for some other things, in terms of how much it changes and shapes us.
I just had a question. What do you suggest that we take from the real life stories of the Foundlings and add to our theatrical adaptation of Coram Boy this time?
Yeah, so Coram Boys, I mean, it's brilliantly researched and written, and it does what fiction should do. One of my colleagues was, oh, that book, they've just not got that. You couldn't do that with the tokens. And it's fiction. That's the joy of it, right? They're bringing things to life in a different way. I'd say, and this is my own bias, I would say make sure you're in the emotions, because I think she draws them out really well in the book. And one of the things I learn and continue to learn from people and friends who have been in care and people who've been forced to give up children is the emotionality of it is incredibly complicated. And we are, particularly in the UK, there's a reverence for being reticent about emotional things. And the lovely thing about Coram Boy as a story is it's told through children and through somebody who is, I can't remember how they call it, learning difficulties was what we might say. So somebody who is much more emotive and emotional. And I think the emotion side and learning what happens when you channel the emotions of someone who's experienced different from you, I think that means you can kind of learn and gain from it too as performers. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I also had a question. What do you think is the most important message that we should convey here at King's in the play Coram Boy?
Yeah, so thanks. When I ask people of different generations about the experience of being in care, the things that they say are frustrating is the continued stigma. And the thing that they know to be true is how incredibly resilient they are because of having such destabilized and disrupted experiences so often. They actually navigate things really well. And so that adaptability that comes with actually having had disrupted childhoods is something to understand as well, rather than think of people as being somehow made more vulnerable or more different. Because actually there's an incredible strength to having to respond, and you see that in that story as well. And that hope that's through that story is something you hear a lot as well with people in care in a positive way. And the whole project of the Foundling Hospital and the artworks made is all about hope and bigger stories, bigger pictures.
I think that's it question-wise. So I'll hand over to Mr. Young.
Thank you very much, Alfie, and thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you very much, Emma, as well, for such a fascinating talk on such an interesting topic as well. I'm sure that everybody who has tuned in today, whether in person or online, is really appreciative for everything that you shared to us about the Foundling Museum. I remember visiting a few years ago, and I think I'm definitely overdue another visit. So I'll be certain to, perhaps over the Christmas holidays, I'll be sure to pay a visit.
Yeah.
And for those of you that have enjoyed Emma's talk, I would highly encourage you not only to kind of make sure that you have a ticket for the upcoming production of Coram Boy, but also to consider our next Enlightening Minds talk, which is going to be on the 3rd of December. Professor Sarah Holbolt talking about the rise of populism in Europe. But if I could just ask everybody perhaps to put their hands together one more time to thank Emma for her talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you all for coming, and a safe journey home. Thank you very much.
Thanks.